Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's episode of Dungeons & Dragons Horror Stories, we have a few tales of players and a DM that brings the cringe level to 11. But first, if you end up enjoying the video, it would be awesome if you could like and comment, as it does really help the channel grow. And if you aren't already, consider clicking the subscribe button and the bell so you can be notified whenever I upload a new video. Also, if you would like to support the Doge directly, check out the Patreon page. With the preamble out of the way, let's get right into the cringe. Fart Porn, or a lesson in checking your screenshots, by Reddit user Fifthar Gaming. So to preface, this is the only story I have close to horror, but it was still fairly shocking. Short and simple, the cast was me, Paladin, DM, and 2 other players in a Pathfinder 1E game. So, this happened a few years ago when I first got into tabletop RPGs. It was my first real open world setting, and I was excited to dive into it. I had met the group through 2 other players being co-workers. They had actually started me with the more strict Pathfinder society before moving on to this particular campaign. It was at this point that Paladin was added to our group, and he seemed okay enough. First session went off well, and we managed to get some fighting in with typical kobolds and all that good stuff. It was great. The second session went about the same, but the third session is where things got awkward. Our schedules were not lining up well to meet in person, so we decided to do Roll20 for our next game night. Everything was set up by our DM, so we only needed to log in and play. Most of us were on PCs, while Paladin was on a tablet. The first awkward moment happens when we all got logged in, and Paladin's camera comes on. And he's shirtless. Not a problem, dude is in his own home, whatever. It was just awkward, as he seemed surprised and quickly disabled his camera. We all laugh it off, it's fine. Anyway, the game begins, and every time it comes to Paladin to roll, there's a lot of delay, as Roll20 alone is lagging or causing him to roll multiple times. It's horrendous. So we asked to see a screenshot of his settings just to make sure nothing was wrong there. The image we all received was forever burned into our memories. Now, I'm not here to kink shame anyone, but maybe, before you send your friends and someone you barely know a screenshot of your browser with the tabs open saying, quote, face-sitting farting, and quote, girls farting. Also, maybe, just maybe, that's why you're lagging and having issues, my dude. Things got real quiet and real awkward as we all waited for him to realize his mistake, but he never did. I didn't know him that well, and I'm an anxious, quiet type around new people as is. I certainly didn't want to be the one to tell him. I hoped his friends would. I was wrong. Awesome. So he ends up getting frustrated with the lag and declares he's leaving, and the rest of us just sort of log off after that. We never did return to that game, which is depressing because I was enjoying it. It's a tad bit upsetting that we now know exactly what he was doing during our session, having a session of his own that most likely derailed us and causing his lag. He's actually in a LARP group that I'm in, and I honestly can't help but remember that every time I see him. It's just not something you forget. I still don't know him that well, it's a pretty large group, and as far as I know, the guys closest to him still haven't told him either. Well, I would say that this story is more funny than anything. Just a bit of advice. When you're playing a tabletop RPG online with other people, it might not be the best time to have a session of your own, as OP put it. Not really anything left to say on this one, so let's just move on. The DM that took me DMing personally, by Reddit user Artifacts. I've been playing D&D for about 5 years on and off now, mostly with friends, and have been a player and a DM for that time, but mostly I DM. I have my fair share of horror stories, a DM in college that told us homework was not an excuse for missing sessions, a shoot first, ask questions later player that interrupted both me and players to shoot first. Players making joke characters and then being stunned when the joke stops being funny after 5 minutes. The usual. But this was definitely the weirdest horror story I've come out with. I mostly DM, but I did start out as a player in my first campaign. It was the D&D is more important than homework, guys campaign. Safe to say, that campaign didn't actually last very long, and we dropped him fairly quickly. But we didn't want to stop, so we hunted around for a few more DMs, trying to find something that worked, but wasn't satisfied. That's when one of the people in the group, who we'll call Mike, decided, hey, why couldn't they give it a shot? All of us agreed, and we all joined Mike's campaign. So, how was Mike as a DM? They were fine, I'd say. It was the first time DMing, and they definitely fell into some first-time DM traps, railroading story moments, ignoring very high rolls in order to force combat, stiff roleplay. But all of that is retrospect now. At the time, I thought they were doing a good job. They did have 2 annoying habits though. 1. Any bit of feedback, or sometimes even a joke about an event or NPC, was met with a lot of pushback. Once they described a player doing CPR on an NPC, but they didn't roll high enough to do it correctly, so my friend went, "Oops, there go her ribs," and the table and I laughed. Mike proceeded to pinch the bridge of their nose, with a really distressed look on their face. We asked what was wrong, and they screamed, quote, "I'm a shitty DM." 2. They really wanted to play exactly like how Critical Role played. This was 2016 to 2017, so Critical Role was still in its first campaign, and not nearly the juggernaut it is now, but still pretty popular. Some stuff was minor, like using the, quote, "How do you want to do this?" at the ends of fights, which, I love you Matt Mercer, but did you have to coin such a common sentence as your catchphrase? But others were a lot more major, like forcing my friend to be a gunslinger and then trying very hard to turn him into literally Percy. But largely, the game was fine. I was a bit disappointed it didn't have a big story, but it was fun enough. Eventually, I decided, hey, I'd like to give DMing a shot. I asked Mike if I could try it out at their table, since at the time I was a college student in a very small dorm, and they said sure. I told everyone that I wasn't sure if this campaign would continue, but I wanted to try out one session, and they all agreed. The session went well, and I decided to have a full campaign. Mike and I agreed to an alternating schedule, their campaign one week and mine the next. This seemed fine, for a while. The first red flag was getting a new player for each campaign. Something to note, I used miniatures, and Mike did not. I used miniatures because I thought it would be fun to go ahead and buy a couple to use, which has since grown into a hoarding and painting obsession. Please save me, I have a 3D printer now, and there's plastic and resin everywhere. I brought my minis with me for a session and put them on the table, and the new player went, "Whoa, you have minis!" And Mike said, quote, "Yeah, I don't use them because I have priorities." The table kinda giggled, and I made some jokes about my own priorities, and we moved on, but the passive aggression of their tone stuck with me. Then they began to backseat DM. I would tell a player to roll a perception check, and they'd go, quote, "Actually, I'd do investigation. Roll intelligence instead of wisdom." But the most annoying thing they would do at this stage is, and I swear to God this is true, they would actually interrupt me to explain how Matt Mercer does something. I'd be describing an effect, and they'd go, quote, "Matt Mercer does it like this." Or I'd be thinking about changing a rule, and he would say, quote, "Try it this way. That's what Matt Mercer does." Just all the time. Matt Mercer does it like this. Look, I love Matt Mercer. The dude seems great. I'm a huge fan of Critical Role. But I wasn't then, because I couldn't stand the damn thing. With the way they just constantly shoved it in my face, I couldn't bring myself to watch it out of sheer annoyance. It's a shame really, cause Critical Role is really good. Eventually, I messaged them and asked them to stop. They said, "Okay, I will," which is a perfectly appropriate response, and I thought that was the end of it. But 5 minutes later, they sent a message that said, quote, "I'm sorry, I know I'm awful." And I had to calm them down and say it's no big deal, just don't keep doing it. Then we went into the next stage. Remember how I said I was disappointed with their game's lack of story? Well, I made mine have a lot of story. I need you to understand just how much this story suffered from first-time DM syndrome. It was forced and convoluted and detached from the players, and just a big old mess. I don't want to sound like I'm self-deprecating too hard here. I do love writing and have gotten a few short things published, but I'm just saying that writing these kinds of stories and homebrewing a DM campaign are different worlds, and I had yet to learn that. It didn't matter though, because whenever a story beat happened, they would exclaim, quote, "Why can't I do something like this?" When a person would bring up a plot point in the group chat to speculate, they would go, quote, "It's so cool, I'm not talented enough for this." And each time, we'd be like, "Hey, you can do it if you want, give it a shot." And they wouldn't. They'd just go, quote, "This is good and I'm bad." After a while of that, Mike started to get rude. I ran a fight that admittedly did not go well, due to my inexperience at the time. Later though, when the thing they found in the fight came up, Mike says, quote, "No offense, but I hated that fight." Later, the characters did hardcore drugs, rock on, and I had them roll a con check to see if they'd pass out. Mike rolled their eyes and went, quote, "Have you ever done drugs?" It should also be noted that in their campaign, they started to treat me differently. My character was called stupid often. I was made fun of by them. My character's in-game love interest sold his soul, and my character offered to trade hers for it, to which the soul-stealing god said, quote, "Are you stupid?" Looked at the love interest and went, quote, "She's so stupid." Very often having NPCs just say to me, quote, "You're stupid." On its own, maybe that's not a huge thing, but combined with everything else, it started to add up. It all accumulated into one thing though. Tensions had risen pretty high at this point. Everyone could see how Mike was acting during my games, and how they treated me during Mike's games. In my games, Mike would often claim that I had skipped them in combat. This, in fairness, probably did happen. I have ADHD, and, well, combat is complicated. Even when I think I'm keeping track, I will sometimes skip people. It just happens. Then, when they claimed this, I would just have them roll then. But one day, they said, quote, "You skipped me," and I realized that we were very close to their turn again. I apologized and said this time we'll just go back around, and they can go on their turn and roll extra damage or something. They got tense and said flatly, quote, "Okay," and the whole room went quiet. Everyone stared at them. I began to speak, and they said, quote, "I mean, it doesn't make sense, but you're the DM." I snapped a little bit, I'll admit, threw down my pencil and notebook and said, "Fine, go." They rolled to hit and missed, and then said, quote, "Guess it was a big deal for nothing." The session ended shortly after that. There is one thing that makes me rethink that moment and all of the other "you skipped me" comments. Because after that, whenever they claimed I skipped them, I would just have them roll then, to avoid that moment of drama. Eventually, they said, "You skipped me" in combat, and I was about to have them go when I stopped and realized I hadn't. They'd gone on their turn and used their action to heal someone. I reminded them of that, and the others at the table nodded, and they went quiet before going, "Oh, right, I remember." They then never claimed I skipped them again. Tensions did not stop rising, and eventually the game just fell apart. Between this and another disrespectful player, shoot first ask questions later guy, the atmosphere around the table just became pure tension, and I called it off. I do have some good memories of that campaign, but it was a huge mess. My friend would later tell me that Mike would message them in a panic, that everyone liked my game more, and was going to leave theirs to play mine every week. I feel like I should state that Mike was 5 years older than me, if not more. I was 19 at the time when Mike was in their mid to late 20s. It just baffles me to this day. Mike eventually moved, and we fell out of touch a long time ago, but I will never forget this as one of the weirdest, most toxic D&D people I've ever played with. The dreaded Matt Mercer Effect. I personally see this particular phenomenon as a double-edged sword. On one hand, for myself, watching Critical Role has personally helped me come out of my shell more when role-playing, as I kind of use the players and Matt Mercer as an example of how it can be done. Though, I was playing D&D before I ever watched an episode of it. Unfortunately, some people's first introduction to tabletop RPGs is Critical Role, and then they want to get into it themselves and expect it to be exactly like a show with the professional voice actors and production budget. Sometimes to the point that they will straight up try to force things ripped right from the show into their games. It also sounds like Mike had some self-esteem issues that would come out in game, constantly comparing his game to OP's, and I can see how that would get very old very quickly. Then to try and pull a fast one on OP by saying he didn't take his turn. If OP did accidentally skip Mike's turn, they could have said something to OP. That tells me Mike wasn't actually paying attention to the game. DMing can be a challenge, and DMs can use all the help they can get. If they miss something, let them know. Though, it does sound like Mike was making it up sometimes, which is pretty scummy. Anyways, that is just the thoughts that came out of this Doge's brain. What do you think of the story? Let's move on to the last one of the day. The New Player Who Ended Up Being a Lost Cause, by Reddit user Leon Redblaze. As a DM and general D&D fan, I pride myself on my ability to help new players get their bearings in a weird world of numbers. I even help people bring unrealistic or weird ideas to life. Like, one player once came to me with an idea of a cleric who worshipped a luck goddess, and whose spells were totally random and decided by dice rolls every day in game. Instead of that, since it sounded more tedious than fun to me, I helped him go through and make a trickery domain cleric / wild magic sorcerer with luck bending abilities instead. He actually loved the idea, and I felt it turned out much better than he expected it to be. But there so far was only one player that I DM'd for that was a total lost cause. He was really a friend of a friend, specifically a friend's cousin. Normally, as part of session 0, I go over who is playing what, so I know what kind of stories or plot points people might be planning, or if they need help building a character mechanically. Of course, if a player doesn't ask for help, I usually trust them enough to let them do it on their own. This was the case for the cousin, where I started off by offering to help him build a character, since this was his first time. He told me that he had it since my friend had loaned him some D&D books. My friend confirmed it, so I was okay with that. When I went around asking people what they wanted to play, I got the cousin, and his response was, word for word, quote, "I want to play a drunken master monk pixie." Huh, okay. I remember thinking that sounded funny, and I wasn't sure if pixie was a playable race at that time, but I allowed it because it sounded like something that could be fun to play out. So the first session comes around. The players are all in the market for different reasons, with the plot hook meant to bring them all together, being the sudden appearance and attack of cultist terrorists that would play a part in the larger plot of the campaign. Before battle, the cousin RPs his character sipping from a bottle of alcohol, and describing his character getting very drunk just from a little bit because he's smaller, and he managed to get some laughs. Then, everyone RPs their introduction, cue magical explosion, and sudden pre-planned attack on the market. Soldiers rush in to fight the attackers, and the cousin suddenly decides in this moment that he's wanted for stealing. "You didn't say that before," I told him surprised. But he said, quote, "It's part of his backstory." The backstory, I, the DM never read or heard about. On his turn, he attacks one of the guards. Not the dangerous cultist attacking bystanders, but the guards, leading to the same guard attacking him on his turn. I landed a hit with a spear. I roll a 4 on a d8 and add 2. The cousin looks at me weirdly for a second and says, quote, "I'm dead." At this point, I'm flabbergasted. I ask, "How are you dead? You're a monk." He shrugged and said, quote, "I only have 3 HP. I ask for his sheet and look at it, realizing that he does, in fact, have 3 HP. The stats that he's using are, and I only learned this later, from the monster manual for pixies. Realizing that this guy had made something unusable, I told him that I was just going to continue the encounter and I could help him figure out something new after the battle was over. He agreed, and we continued the battle. Once everything was done, I asked him what character he wanted to try and make so I could just help him make it real fast. He looked at me and said with excitement, quote, "A fighter with no arms." I shared his excitement only because I thought it sounded cool. I could throw in mechanics of him using prosthetics, maybe throw in a bit of magic. I pitched some ideas on how the fighter could still be a fighter, but the response I got was, quote, "Nah, I just want him to have no arms, so when he goes to do something, he remembers that he doesn't have arms and gets sad." This was the first time I ever vetoed a character idea. I told him no, mainly on the grounds that D&D, at the end of the day, is still a game. You can make jokes, but even the weirdest joke character should have something they can contribute to the party. A fighter who can't do anything but stand there would be a burden to the party, and the joke about him forgetting about his disability would get old fast and might make people uncomfortable. So I suggested he try a different idea. Up to this point, he didn't seem to be getting mad or angry. We were just having a normal conversation. Yet, I feel like the next character he made was specifically out of spite for me telling him he had to contribute. Cue character number 3, Pacifist Bard. Clearly, this character was much less about one-liners and had more of a role in the party, but it quickly became obvious that this guy had no plans to actually work with the party. I almost wished that he kept the sprite monk and just revived him after every battle. This bard was more properly made, but he was also made with point buy, with the player dumping all of his points into charisma, leading to him acting like he was the only one who could do anything charismatic. Not to mention trying to abuse the persuasion skill to steal money from the party. He didn't actually RP all that much, just rolled persuasion at random times. He ran away from battles or got mad when the party did a persuasion roll without letting him do it, even if he wasn't even there at the time. Ultimately, I realized he only cared about being the center of attention, being the joke that everyone laughs about, or being the character who is at the center of everything. I didn't kick him, but only because he left after the second session. I haven't played with him since, and I really don't care to. But he helped me realize that some people make fun characters, while others only care about the attention their character can get them. Because, once he made a character that wasn't totally humorous, he did everything he could to hog the spotlight. Well, there was definitely some character concepts in there that could have been kind of funny if done right. I thought OP's interpretation of the fighter could have been cool, but with the player just wanting a character without arms, it didn't seem like it would be right for a player character, as the humorous parts would get old very quickly. That type of thing might be better for an NPC. But then, instead of keeping with the concept, the player just made kind of a spotlight hog. Thankfully, OP didn't have to kick him, and he quit himself. Have you ever dealt with a player that just wanted the spotlight? If so, how did you manage it? If you have a story that you would like to be read on a video, feel free to comment it down below, post it to the channel subreddit, or even just @ me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope all of your rolls are natural 20s. Until next time.